All right, Steve. So you and I have been working together on a bit of a co-preview for a pair of upcoming games for the Nintendo Switch. Those, of course, being Famicom Detective Club, The Missing Heir, and The Girl Who Stands Behind. And you and I, for this preview, have been able to play through Chapter 5 of both games. To be clear, Steve, you are playing The Missing Heir, while I am playing The Girl Who Stands Behind. And yeah, it's time for us to get together and talk about our experiences so far. We're going to avoid spoilers to the extent that we can. Of course, this is a visual novel. These are visual novels, story-based games, so kind of everything is a spoiler. But we're gonna keep really important story information to a minimum. But I've been doing this intro. I've been talking. So Steve, I'm gonna throw it over to you. How are you feeling so far about your time with Famicom Detective Club: The Missing Heir?
So far, I'm enjoying what I'm playing. I didn't think when I picked up Famicom Detective Club: The Missing Heir that I would really be all that into it because, as you guys know, I haven't really played Ace Attorney. I'm not a big visual novel person.
Right.
But that being said, a good story is a good story. And at least up until the point that we're allowed to discuss, I've become kind of wrapped up in what's going on and trying to peel back the layers of this thing and figure it out. So far, so good is what I would say. Pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it for me as well. I will say that on my end, I would say the story has started a little slowly. And it wasn't until I got to around chapter 5, which is, the point at which we can't talk about past that for this preview, that it really started to get its hooks in me. So, yeah, certainly it took me a while to warm up to some of the characters. There isn't, from what I can tell, a whole lot of deep characterization going on here. This is more of kind of like a general murder mystery, at least on my end. But something happens at the end of chapter 5 for the girl who stands behind that I kind of, for the first time, I kind of sat up and was like, whoa. This is something for the first time. I actually didn't see this coming. Everything up to that had been like, okay, this is kind of a neat murder mystery, but I'm not too into it yet. But this thing happened, and I'm like, oh, okay, the game's changed a little bit now. This is going in a place that maybe I didn't expect, as much. So, I guess let's talk about how the stories differ, I suppose. And I've done a little research in advance of this preview, and as I understand it, the one you're playing, The Missing Heir, is actually a sequel to The Girl Who Stands Behind, even though The Girl Who Stands Behind was released later on the Famicom. So it's kind of interesting how yours came out first and then mine came out, but it's a prequel to the one you're playing. So for me, the story so far has been kind of a murder mystery tinged in horror. It's definitely kind of like a horror ghost story type thing. Is that kind of what's going on with The Missing Heir as well?
Not quite. So,
Okay.
part of the reason that I chose The Missing Heir as opposed to The Girl Who Stands Behind is because it reminded me a lot of a manga that I had read a few years ago called The Memorandum of Kyoko Okitagami.
Oh,
And
okay.
that's about a detective who every day her memory resets. She just forgets. And that's not like the central plot element to Famicom Detective Club, but the elevator pitch that was given to me when we got these copies was that Missing Heir was about an amnesiac detective, and I was like, oh, that sounds really cool, like a detective who forgot everything.
Hmm.
And that is just the most basic of plot lines, but uh, this one, there's definitely a murder mystery at play here, or at least they lead you to believe that. I don't know for a fact that I'm actually investigating a murder yet,
Okay.
which makes things really interesting. There's kind of this core question of did did a murder actually occur? Am I actually trying to find a murderer, or am I just being misdirected by a number of people? And there's kind of this rogues gallery of people surrounding this event where no one really wants to be straight with me. And you can tell that I'm being
Interesting.
lied to by every single person I encounter, but it's hard to suss out where the lies end and the truth begins
Okay.
with a lot of these people. So I'm at a point where I'm just highly suspicious of every single person. And I thought I had nailed down my suspect. I was like, okay, the story's going this way. I know exactly who's involved in this, and well, the person I suspected is dead. So
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, that's not quite what has happened on my end. So I certainly have my suspects in terms of what's going on so far. Although my suspect is not dead yet, so that hasn't happened. But my game does essentially at like after the intro, where you essentially get introduced to the player character, which is you, I guess. At least for my game, the girl who stands behind. It opens with your player character running away from the cops, and he's looking for his long lost parents. We don't really know a whole lot about him, why his parents are long lost. He's running away from the cops, and he ends up falling in with a guy named Detective Utsugi, who basically takes him under his wing. He's like, hey, come stay with me at my detective agency, and I'm going to
Oh.
teach you to be a junior detective, and you're going to help me investigate various cases. And that's kind of how things start.
Oh. You
Oh,
you
okay, so that's
just you just connected the games for me.
okay,
So
good, good.
so this makes a lot of sense. Now I really want to play yours.
Nice.
So basically, you open up and you're on the ground. You open your eyes, and some good Samaritan has found you, and you don't remember anything. Good, this person takes you back to their place, helps you kind of get your bearings a little bit, but you don't remember anything. And they tell you, like, hey, maybe you should go back to where I found you and see if there's any clues. And as you investigate this, a beautiful young woman appears in front of you, and she tells you, hey, let's go back to work. And where do you go? The Utsugi Detective Agency. So
Interesting.
I
Okay.
believe that you and I are playing as the same character, the same junior detective, because
Okay.
as soon as you get back, they mention, oh, Detective Utsugi took you under his wing a few years ago and has trained
There
you
it
to be a
is.
detective. So I
Okay.
feel like this is kind of the connective tissue between these two games.
Right. Okay. So then, yeah, that makes sense. And I assume maybe later on in the missing heir, maybe we'll find out more about our, protagonist's long lost parents. I don't know. But that certainly seems to be a plot point that they set up right at the very beginning of The Girl Who Stands Behind. And then essentially, once Detective Utsugi takes you under his wing, you get assigned your first case, and it is straight up. In my game, it's a murder. There's a victim right off the bat. There's a point where you inspect her body to see, if there's any signs of, like murder weapons or, how she was killed or anything. So mine, at least, it starts off with an actual murder, and then the game goes on from there, and you're trying to piece together, well, who killed her and why, and then it kind of loops in this whole thing about this local legend about the girl who stands behind, which is like this ghostly girl who has been spotted at the local school where a lot of my game takes place, standing behind people and haunting them, and covered in blood and stuff. So
Oh, wow.
mine definitely has more of a horror bent to it, kind of a soup. Now I don't know if there actually is a ghost involved. There may be something bigger at play here that makes it seem like there's a ghost going on, but there's not actually one. That's kind of left in the air up to where I am now, and of course I wouldn't tell you what would happen if I knew. But yeah, so mine definitely has kind of a ghost story horror angle to it, but it sounds like yours is played more as a straight mystery.
Yeah, so mine, basically, you wake up, you realize that you've lost all your memories, and a couple of characters help kind of bring you up to speed, at least insofar as what your name is, who you are, where you work, and you eventually discover that at your desk at the Utsugi Detective Agency, you had left a note, a very vague, cryptic note that just mentions the name of a village. And
Okay.
so you travel to this village, and kind of similarly to the school you mentioned, this is where you spend the vast majority, excuse me, this is where you spend the vast majority, or at least, so far of the game. So you're
Hmm.
in Myojin Village, and you end up discovering that you had written that down because you were working a case for an extremely wealthy family that lives in that village. And the villagers have this legend, so to speak, about this family that you're investigating. The matriarch of the family is dead, and some of the members of the family suspect foul play. They suspect that she didn't just die; she was murdered. So your kind of your goal, at least at the beginning, is to discover whether the matriarch was, just died of natural causes, as the doctors and everyone else are saying, or if somebody actually did set out to murder her, and it kind of spirals out of control from there. But the villagers believe that if she was murdered, that she would rise from her grave and start taking the lives of those responsible.
As
And
one does.
yeah, of course,
Yeah. Of
anytime.
course.
And
Yeah.
so, people say it's a silly legend, but lo and behold, as you delve further into this mystery, people just start dying left and right. And,
Okay.
it kind of is a slower burn. You don't get that initial, I would say that the missing heir starts off kind of slow because you're trying to figure out details about yourself, and then you start remembering the case you're working on and becoming more involved in that. So it wasn't until about chapter 3 or so that things started getting real crazy, and by the end of chapter 5, I'm just like, wow, who's gonna get killed next? And I thought about um, this game initially, and in the first couple chapters, I was like, I don't see why this couldn't have come out in America. And then, as
Uh-huh.
you start to find more dead bodies and more crazy crime scenes, and there's a lot of references to other, not death related things that Nintendo definitely wouldn't have talked about in the late '80s, like there's constant references to smoking and cigarettes and
Right.
tobacco vending machines and backgrounds, and those were all things that 1980s Nintendo was very very keen to stay away from. There's a lot of religious imagery too, actually,
Oh, interesting.
in this
Okay.
game. So yeah, it's I mean, with the theme of death and funerals and stuff like that, you see a lot of religious based imagery, um, and so it is like a really interesting game so far. But yeah, I would say that this one leans kind of further away from the horror vibe and is more of a straight up detective story.
Interesting. Okay, yeah. So they're then the two games, while they are a duology, they're companion pieces and ostensibly meant to be played together. They are quite different. It sounds like in tone and the settings that it takes place in. Mine takes place around a fairly traditional modern day Japanese town, with a school and various people's houses. At least up to chapter 5. That I may travel further after this, but it's been pretty fairly typical modern day Japan setting so far. But you touched on something just now, which was just how interesting this game is, and it is. It's interesting to be playing a Nintendo game that's essentially a visual novel, and of course these are actually 30-ish year old games. These came out on the Famicom originally, but even knowing that, this just it feels like a very un Nintendo like game, doesn't it?
Yeah, it feels like a unique piece of Nintendo's history. You and
Yeah.
I both, given our backgrounds, tend to be fairly well educated in the type of products that Nintendo puts out, especially, the
Right.
older stuff. And I can't say that I've ever played anything like this in Nintendo's history. It kind of stands alone thematically among all the other stuff they put out, especially during the Famicom era.
Yeah, it really does. And as I was kind of doing a little research about these games, I found out something really interesting that both of these games are actually written by Yoshio Sakamoto, who would go on to direct Metroid and work on various Metroid games. He's
Wow.
much better. He's much better known for Metroid than he is obviously Famicom Detective Club. And I didn't know that there was a common thread there. So yeah, the same guy who has worked on so many Metroid titles also wrote these games. And now, I do have a question for you because one thing that's been pretty cool for me is, back in the day when we were playing Smash Brothers Melee, there was kind of an exotic feel to some of that game's content because not only did you get Marth and Roy in the game's roster, which we didn't know much about Fire Emblem then, like who are these weird characters? Never seen these guys, but there were certain trophies in the game that also came from Japan only Nintendo franchises, including Ayumi Tachibana, who I had no idea who she was, no context for her back, of course, when I played Melee back in the day. But it's been nice because at least in my game, the girl who stands behind, she figures heavily into it, and I don't want to get too far into how she figures into it because she's turning out to be a very interesting character. But Ayumi Tachibana she figures heavily into this game, and so it's been cool for me to finally get her origin story essentially and figure out what she's all about. Is she in your game as well?
She is.
Okay.
So she is a key component in the missing heir. So I mentioned earlier that a beautiful woman finds you at the very beginning of the game. That's
Hmm.
Ayumi.
Okay.
And it's interesting because she has her look is so dramatically different in the Famicom remake as it is for, or I'm sorry, in the Switch remake as it is in the art for the original Famicom game.
Yeah, she
Uh,
looks very different.
yeah, and I'm curious about this. So I'm playing a game that occurs very clearly, uh, seemingly several years after yours.
Hmm.
So Ayumi is a young adult in the game I'm playing. Is she like a high school student in yours, or
Yeah, essentially, she's like a middle to high school student.
that's
So I believe, yeah, because in my game, the player character I think just finished middle school. So yeah, she's I believe a high school character.
gotcha? Because I was gonna say
Yeah.
she kind of has this dignified presence to her, a bit. Like down to earth, approachable, but almost like she's on the cusp of becoming like a sophisticated older woman in the game.
Oh, she's
Uh,
so different in my game because in mine, she's actually a good friend of the initial, of at least the first murder victim that the game presents, to you right off the bat. And she's very much, at least she seems very unsure of herself, very timid. Yeah, your player character is hesitant to get her involved in anything. He wants to protect her. So she's not at all. She's
oh
very much
wow.
a kind of a timid character, and she's still finding her footing. She was heartbroken over, the murder of the initial victim. Again, they're friends. They started a detective club agency together at their high school. So
Oh.
yeah, this is interesting. This is really making
Yeah.
me want to play your game now.
Yeah, so I mean, in mine, she's a very competent, confident person, and
Interesting.
she
Okay.
is oftentimes, in many ways, in the missing heir, more competent than the player character. Like you spend entire days in game investigating things, whereas Ayumi will, at the end of every day, have some kind of bombshell to drop on you in terms of information that advances the story. Because the way the missing heir is set up, at the end of every chapter, you end up seeing Ayumi and discussing what you investigated that day. And so
Interesting. Okay.
she always has something that you're just like, wow, you're much better at this than I am. So
That
I
is
I
completely
love her
different
as
in
a
mine.
character in this game. I think she is a perfect complement to the main protagonist.
Neat. Okay, yeah, because for the girl who stands behind, each chapter, instead of conferring with her, so far each chapter has really just been your player character kind of thinking and perceiving and piecing things together by himself. And then that
Oh,
kind of leads you, in his own mind. And then and he'll sometimes talk to Detective Utsugi, his mentor, for some guidance for sure. He gets a little light guidance from Utsugi, but generally, my player character has been on his own mostly. And I would say that's probably something that I would consider a complaint for me, is that the player character, I named him after me. He's
yeah.
Detective Ash Paulson, the Japanese Detective Ash Paulson, right? um, and he's just kind of very much a blank slate. And I get that that's kind of in service of the story. He's meant to be kind of a blank slate, at least in my game, I guess. But is that the same in yours? Do you care about him? Does he seem to have his own agency, or is he just kind of an avatar
Yeah, I
for?
would I would say in the missing heir, it's much the same. He's a complete
Okay.
blank slate. He doesn't
Yeah.
really, it's just again an avatar in service of furthering your own goals as the player. But at least I would say that narratively that makes a bit of sense because he doesn't remember anything about himself.
Right.
So he is technically an actual blank slate.
Interesting.
So he has to get told his name by Ayumi. She's like, "You don't know your own name? Like, come on."
Uh-huh.
So it's really an interesting. I think that narratively they at least packaged that one up a little better in the missing heir.
Hmm.
But I agree that as far as the actual main character, I care very little about him. But at the
Same.
same time, I feel like I'm more interested in unraveling kind of the mystery and the story going on here, and I feel like it's doing a really good job of pulling me in on that front.
Nice. Yeah, I would say so too. Like, again, for me, it was a slow start, and I wasn't really feeling it at first, and then chapters 4 and 5 really kind of deepen the mystery a little bit, and then the way chapter 5 ends, well, I was like, whoa, okay, things are getting pretty wild, and it actually has to do with Ayumi, and I don't want to give it away,
Oh,
even though
nice.
we are technically allowed to talk about chapter 5's events. We're not in the business of spoiling these games, and of course, these are visual novels again, so they're all story, and we want to spoil that as little as possible. So with that said, let's go ahead and kind of switch gears and talk about the actual gameplay a little bit, like how this game is played.
Sure.
It is, of course, very much a traditional visual novel. You see everything from the perspective of your player character, first person. Sometimes you can see yourself. There are certain
Yep.
scenes where the camera is, or the illustration is such that you do see your own character. But generally, it is very much like an Ace Attorney, right, where you are seeing the each setting from the eyes of your character.
Yeah. It's if you've ever played like an old visual novel, because my experience, and I don't know if the genre has truly evolved over time, but my limited experience with visual novels was in the mid to late 90s because my dad had a lot of them on his PC, and so I would just play them.
Nice.
Um, and it feels very much like a product of that era because you just kind of like you'll have a window on screen, you'll see the environment, or in this case they're mostly full screen views of environments. There'll be people, and then you have like a little menu in the upper left, and you have options like talk, call,
Same.
look,
Yeah.
and stuff like that, and so you can kind of poke around the area, but the primary or the core gameplay loop is really talking to people, asking them questions to try to get information you want, and then trying to find that right action that kind of moves the chain of events along. I find
Right.
it sometimes to be a little frustrating because sometimes I feel like
Mhm.
it's really obtuse as to what I'm supposed to do. Um,
Same.
I've had a few instances where I talk to everyone and I run through every option and I feel like there's nothing left. And then I choose arbitrarily something from the menu, like remember. And my character
Yeah.
goes, oh, this person said this. And I'm like, remember hasn't worked that way at all before yet. And
Exactly.
that kind of frustrates me because at that point, it's less that I'm trying to figure something out and more that I'm just pushing every menu button to try to just move along. Um,
Yeah.
and I would say that those moments are not, I mean, they're not often, but they do occur frequently enough that there are times where it takes me out of the game a bit and I'm like, all right, we'll just try everything until we can move forward. But I am enjoying the hell out of the story that's happening around these interactions.
Yeah, I would say it sounds like your experience has been very similar to mine. I have certainly run up against a few situations where I feel like I've talked to everybody in every setting that I can, or every location that I can currently access. I've tried every menu item, and I can't find that one specific menu selection that will let me actually move forward with the story. And that's a problem that I would say is endemic to visual novels in general. Certainly as much as I love, not to be fair, I haven't played a ton of them. I think I played a couple more than you maybe, but I haven't played, I'm not like a visual novel fan. I haven't played Danganronpa, but I have played a bunch of Ace Attorney games, which I love. And as much as I love those games, they too suffer from that, where you don't always, that you don't always know what that one menu selection is going to be, or who you need to talk to at a very specific time to actually move the story forward. And so that, I've certainly run up against some situations where I'm just going down the list hoping that one of them will work. And there are, as you said, times where certain menu selections won't work the same way as they did before, so you wouldn't think that you would need to use them. And
Yeah.
so it's a little weird. And sometimes the game will throw you a bone and highlight in
Yep.
yellow what you need to do to actually get more information. Clearly, it'll give you, like, okay, choose this yellow option because it's new and it's going to give you the information you need. But just as many other times, the game won't do that. And it'll just kind of, just, yeah,
Yeah,
just
I
kind
would
of
say I
throw you
would
in the
say
deep end.
the moments where I get the yellow highlighted text are almost more frustrating for me than the moments I don't. And the reason I say that is because they often don't lead you all the way to the next step. So you'll get like, "Oh, hey, here's a
Right,
yellow thing,
true.
talk about that. Here's another yellow thing, do that." And then everything's back to gray, but you still have to figure out what you didn't do. And
Right.
I would say that in those moments, I get far more frustrated than if they had just left it all gray and I had to figure it out. Because I feel like
Yeah.
they're stepping me along a path, but then there's two steps missing, and that to me is can be mildly infuriating.
Yeah, it definitely can. And there are other times where you'll have to choose the same option multiple times in order to move things along. You'll have to talk to the same person about the same thing more than once to kind of massage extra information out of them, but you won't know when that's the case versus when it's not the case. So, I think definitely the gameplay as a visual novel shows its age a little bit in terms that it hasn't really seemingly been updated with any meaningful quality of life features for this Switch remake. You know, of course, I haven't played the original Famicom version. Maybe it is more readily playable, but it doesn't feel as though much has been done to update the minute to minute proceedings. But as you said, the story now has gotten interesting enough where I don't really mind. You know, yeah, those moments of frustration have come up, and they're probably going to continue to come up. But I can't say that I've ever been stuck for more than maybe 5 or 10 minutes.
Yeah, agreed. If I'm actually sitting down and 100% focused on the game, I usually move in and out of those pretty quickly.
Hmm.
It's just a matter of, past a certain point, those menus, at least in the missing air, can become very, very long. So the
They
number
can.
of topics I can talk about, I'm up to like 20 topics, and I'm like, well, I guess I don't know which one moves it along, so I'm going through each and every one until I hit the wall. And like you said, sometimes it's just, oh, I've asked you about this, but I need to do it again so that it moves the scene forward. Which, okay, one thing that I'm surprised we haven't talked about though, because we've talked a lot about the novel and a lot about the gameplay, but we haven't talked at all about the visuals yet.
Right, that's true.
I would,
It's a good looking game, or they are good looking games from what I certainly mine is. I mean, it's very they play it very straight anime, but it's nice, high definition, nicely rendered anime style art. It doesn't it's not blowing my mind or anything, but it looks nice. It's pleasant to look at.
yeah, I get the impression that the character models were done in 3D and then
Yeah, it seemed
animated
like
and
it.
brought back to 2D or something, because there's kind of a weird I don't want to say like low frame rate, but a weird quality to the animation that makes it look as though it's not entirely fluid, but it's also clear that that's very intentional. Um,
Right.
I don't dislike it at all. I actually think it works really well for this game to almost make it feel like you're looking into a book in a weird kind of way.
Yeah,
Um,
there's like a slight bit of depth to it. It's weird. Like it's not all. I mean, obviously it's a 2D game, but yeah, the character models themselves, or such they are, the character renders. Yeah, they have like a slight depth to them, where you can tell that yeah, they seem like they're 3D models presented in 2D with like a slight. Yeah, it's hard to explain, but I know exactly what you're talking about.
yeah, it's definitely on screen for you at this point. So if you're listening, bring up the video and watch, because
There you
you'll
go.
see what we're talking about. But it is
Yeah.
very hard to put into words. That said, like you said, it's a very straightforward anime type of style. I really like it. I like the character designs. It kind of takes me back to when, like I watched anime in the early to mid 90s, and this very much reminds me of that. Speaking of which, the soundtrack for this
Uh huh.
game is a banger. I love it.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
the title screen song, I could listen to it on loop. I don't know if it's
Yeah.
different for you. I don't know if the track itself is different, but the one for the missing air just has kind of this late 80s J-pop kind of vibe to it, and I absolutely adore it.
Okay, interesting, because the music hasn't quite stood out as much for me. It's not bad, and one thing I really do like is that there are three different audio tracks here. You've got the rearrangement for this new Switch version. You've got the original NES track, which doesn't seem to, or the Famicom track, which doesn't seem to be the raw Famicom audio, but more of a mix using like the Famicom chip tune as a base, and then kind of having kind of more like a bit more of a modern mix around that. And then of course you have the Super Famicom remake track as well, at least in my game.
Same.
So yeah, okay, so that's cool. It's nice that you get that mix of, or that option of three different audio tracks depending on kind of how retro an experience you want. But for me, I'll say I'm enjoying the soundtrack. It's not super jumping out at me yet, but there have been a few scenes, especially with the girl who stands behind being what seems to be a bit more horror ghost story focused than your game. It's definitely kind of getting me, some goosebumps. Like kind of creep me out in certain scenes. So while I won't say the music has really stood out to me in terms of like being full of bangers like it has for you, I'm still enjoying the music on my end as well.
Yeah, I would say that, the soundtrack is pretty good. One thing that I was surprised by, I was really, really impressed with, was the quality of the Japanese voiceover that's included with this game.
Yes,
Like,
it's really good.
Yeah, every line, even the main character, is fully voiced, and if that takes you out of it, they actually have the option to only turn off the main character's spoken lines, which I thought was
Right.
interesting. But there is a scene, like I mentioned, my game has a lot of murders going on, and there's a
Uh huh.
scene in which you have to talk to the wife of someone who was murdered, and I mean that that actor's performance, that actress's performance was so chilling. Like you could hear the despair in her voice, like the desperation. She is. I don't want to reveal too much because obviously it's a plot point. But she is pleading with you to do something, and just the anguish in this person's voice is so intense. Like I felt uncomfortable listening to her deliver those lines, and I was just like,
Interesting.
God, man, like they really went all out for the voice talent in these games.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I certainly haven't heard any performances that I've been unimpressed by. And even if, even the player character, his delivery is so neutral and so just kind of not flat, but just very inconspicuous, I guess, that,
Yeah.
even if you are the kind of person where you really want to try to become that character and feel like you're that character, I don't think leaving his voice on is going to take you out of it very much.
His
Just because it's such inconspicuous delivery.
Yeah, the delivery kind of reminds me of if I were to imagine that his lines were being read in my inner monologue versus,
Uh huh.
by somebody trying to emote is how I feel that
Right.
it's kind of inoffensive in a way, if that makes sense. Like it just,
Right.
yeah, I agree with you. It's just there. I don't feel one way or the other about it. I'm not like, oh God, this, it doesn't take me out of the game. It doesn't draw me further in.
Right.
It's just there.
One thing I would have liked to see, and I think is a bit of a letdown, especially for a remake of this game in 2021, is and this could this could change if the player character becomes figures much more heavily into the story later on in either of our games. But the player character's identity seems to be unimportant enough that I wish there was like a female version as well. Like,
Yep.
why can't you play as a female 15-year-old kid who who's searching for their long lost parents, right? Like that seems to be a bit of an oversight, but it also might be the case that they didn't want to push things too far with this remake.
That's the thing though, because and I know you don't speak Japanese to the same level that I do.
No.
Um, and I'm listening to the way they deliver lines, specifically when they talk about the main character in my game, and it's all gender neutral stuff. So,
Hmm.
they always refer to you as the person from Utsugi Detective Agency. They never say
Right.
the
That's
boy
true.
from Detective Agency. So it's always, you know, the person from the detective agency, and I'm like, that could have been a girl. So
Right.
my and even so, like I think about it and I'm like, okay, I get that it would be a significant alteration to the existing game to include a gender option, and I don't know what happens in the back half of this game. Maybe there's a romance between the main character and another character or something.
Uh huh.
But even then, like, is that something that can't be done? I don't know, but I can't imagine a scenario where you couldn't gender swap the main character, where it would
Yeah.
become I can't imagine a scenario where it becomes problematic to swap this character. They're
Same. At least
they're
from what I've seen so far. Yeah.
Yeah, their gender doesn't factor into their identity as a character whatsoever. So,
Right.
maybe there's some reason other than, well, I mean, the reason is probably they ported these and weren't going to do a whole lot beyond porting them because, like you said earlier, the gameplay feels like 1988 gameplay. It doesn't
It
feel like
does.
they took a fine look at this and said, okay, here's what needs changing beyond the art and the voice acting, both of which are fantastic. I'm
Yeah.
very happy with those, but I would wager that in a normal year, had last year been a normal year, that we might have seen another instance where Famicom Detective Club came out only in Japan. If Nintendo had their
Maybe.
development resources running full steam ahead, I wonder if we would have gotten this. And in that sense, I'm really grateful that we did because these are actually pretty good, like compelling stories, and that I likely would not have experienced otherwise. So I'm happy with what I'm playing so far. I think that I would love to see some quality of life changes, the ability to swap genders with the main character since it is kind of an avatar for the player.
Yeah.
Um, and by the way, just to address your earlier point, I'm also Steve Bowling, the Japanese detective. So
Nice. I
I
love it.
did the
Yeah.
exact same thing.
Nice. Yeah, I do wish, like, maybe, yeah, as you said, it would be nice if you could gender swap the player character because they essentially just serve as an avatar. I also feel as though even on the fastest text scroll setting menus, when I'm, trying to figure out how to move forward in some of those instances we mentioned earlier, and I'm going through each menu item, the menu feels just a little bit too sluggish, and I wish it
Yes.
could be a little faster. But, those are all pretty minor complaints at the end of the day. And I mean, as you said, I just kind of feel fortunate that we're getting to experience these games outside of Japan now because, Nintendo of America knows that the market for this game isn't probably going to be massive. So I can't imagine we can ask for too much. I can't imagine they spent too much relatively on remaking and remastering these games. So I think what we're getting here, just the in terms of the ability to finally play these games outside of Japan is pretty exciting, despite some blemishes in the fact that these games do still kind of feel like they play like 1989 games.
Agreed. I think that there's a lot of things I like that are in the game. The ability to hide the UI so that you can take screenshots of some of that cool art, I really
Yeah, I
like.
like that.
I like the fact that you can look up the history of what was said in case you got distracted and had to look away. My number one, and I say this about every game that has this feature, my number one favorite feature of this is that when you continue the game, it will give you a recap of the story so far so that you
Yes,
know where the
I
hell you
yeah.
left off. Thank you.
I love that. It's such a like more games should do that. I always appreciate it when JRPGs or other story heavy games do that. I'm playing Yakuza Like a Dragon right now, and that has a story synopsis section as well, and I really appreciate that because sometimes I have to take extended breaks from the game. And while that won't be the case with this game because we're under a preview and review deadline, it's still nice to be able to kind of recap all the events that have happened every time you sit down to play the game.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite things because as I can discuss now, I've been playing this and Returnal at the same time, and so
Right.
sometimes I have to put one down to pick up the other, since I'm juggling content for both of these, and it is really nice after spending even half a day away from Famicom Detective Club to come back and just have them remind you like, oh yeah, you were investigating this specific person, and this is the lead that you're following right now so that I can just jump right back in and feel like I'm not overwhelmed with what the hell was I doing.
Right, exactly. Well, cool. It sounds like overall, then, preview wise, we're liking what we've played so far, despite a few, blemishes here and there.
Yeah, it is a good game so far. I'm optimistic about where the story is headed because just like with your game, Ash, they drop some bombs right at the end of chapter 5 that really serve to kind of keep you invested in the story. And I'm really excited to see where we end up with, this who done it that I'm looking at.
Yeah,
I'm curious to find out if there's an actual supernatural situation going on in your game. Uh,
same.
but yeah, I would say, I'm very interested to see where the story carries me from here. And it's good enough to keep me playing. I'm absolutely gonna power through the rest of this game, and I'm really actually at a point where I think it feels like I'm reading a good book that is slowly becoming a page turner.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. It's slowly, like I have to say, at the beginning, I was like, oh man, I don't know if I'm feeling this. This isn't really grabbing me. Is it me, or is it just really not that interesting? So it does, at least on my end, it's kind of a slow beginning. It takes a couple of chapters to really get going, but once it does, as you said, it becomes something of a page turner, and I really am looking forward to seeing where things go from where I am in the story now, especially with regard to the supernatural part of it all. Is it actually a supernatural thriller, or is there a ghost, or is it an elaborate, something to make it seem like there's a ghost haunting people? I'm very curious to find out.
Yep, exactly the same. So we'll see. And now's probably a good time for us to mention that between now and the time that the review comes out, we will play each other's games
Yes.
so that when we review these, we will both have played both games in their entirety and we'll be assigning both of them a score in a format a little different from this.
Yeah, we'll still be co-reviewing them for sure, but it'll be more of a, more of a scripted type thing instead of a discussion. But, we've heard, a lot of you say that you really want us to do co-reviews, like, like shared and group reviews. And, this presented the perfect opportunity. It is literally a duology of games, and Derek is certainly busy with his own stuff he's working on. So this is a perfect format to try doing that again in. So yeah, as you said, we're gonna play each other's games, and then we'll both be more prepared to give a final score to both games when that review date arrives.
Yeah, I'm very excited to see. I've heard enough now about your game that I'm really wanting to pick that up. So I'm definitely going to hurry through the rest of the missing Heir so that I can start with the girl who stands behind, and find out more about the mysteries that you've kind of told me that you've introduced me to in this conversation.
Yeah, no, I feel the exact same way about yours, especially with regard to, the player character's relationship to Ayumi and Ayumi herself and what's going on with her. So, yeah, this should be a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to reconvening for the review portion of this.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all I've got, unless you have anything else to discuss.
Nope, that's all I got here. So, yeah, well, thank you all so much for listening. If you enjoyed this preview discussion, please drop a like and subscribe to our channel. And of course, if you'd like to, please head on over to patreon.com/gvgaming to check out all the cool perks we offer to our patrons over there. But either way, we just love it if you drop a like and a subscribe. And we'll see you in a little bit for the review portion of Famicom Detective Club. So thank you all for listening, and we'll see you then. Bye.